That's awesome. And I think that would be a good segue into a couple of things I wanted to ask you just regarding touring and playing with different musicians, because you've had a pretty extensive career of playing with a lot of different people. So I was wondering if I could just name a person that you've played with, and if you have any interesting stories to share, any cool things that you learned through playing with them that you'd be willing to share with us. Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Cool. So I figured the best person to start with would be Milt Jackson.
Okay, that was one gig, but it
That
was
was one
fun, and
gig.
there was something I can share with you about that gig. First of all, he was extremely gracious. He was traveling as a single. The MJQ Modern Jazz Quartet was still playing, and he was out on a little tour by himself. So he came to Portland, Oregon. He didn't have a clue who we were, and we put together a group with guitar, bass, and drums. My friend David Friesen, the man that I came out to Portland with, a drummer named Mel Brown, who was a very seasoned player, everything from Motown and Diana Ross to all kinds of jazz gigs. I would say Mel was probably the most seasoned player besides Milt in the group. I was the youngest and the least experienced, but I had been playing long enough that I could certainly get through a set of changes and knew some standards. And Milt obviously had the most experience by far. He'd been on the scene at that point probably for 40 years and stellar reputation, one of the most important modern vibes players in jazz. So he showed up and not a trace of attitude. The nicest man in the world. He said, let's just play some tunes. We don't need to rehearse, and let's just get a sound check. And we wanted to make sure he had all our first and last names correctly pronounced so that he could introduce us. So I looked at this man who had so much experience and showing up in Portland, Oregon, not knowing us, immediately set us at our ease, treated us with courtesy and respect, and the gig was fun and easy. And I have no memory of what it sounded like now. I think we did well enough. He didn't seem upset or bothered by anything. So I've had a few of those experiences in the past. And what I took from that was that if you are the experienced player in the group, I think the way to have everyone else in the band feel relaxed and at ease is just to immediately be friendly, maybe have some suggestions about how the evening should go if you're the leader, but don't do it in a way that feels overbearing. You don't want folks to feel uptight or concerned about anything. And the audience sees the joy that you're making in the music together, and they, especially if they know if you're an experienced leader showing up and the other folks in the band are not as well known or not as experienced, I think the audience enjoys seeing you putting them at ease. And in some cases, many people in the audience are friends of the folks in the group if it's a local band. And I think that just makes everyone feel great. So my goal, whoever I'm playing with, and I think Bill certainly had this feeling for that gig, just make it an experience of joy and sharing, and that communicates that feeling is communicated amongst the musicians on the bandstand. That feeling then comes out to the audience, and they bring it back to us. And then it's the nice experience for everybody, and that's what the music should be. So that was my little lesson from my one night with Milt Jackson, for sure.
That's awesome. That's really cool. So how about Art Farmer?
One gig also,
That's fine.
interesting. Also
You had
through my
plenty of good
friend
stuff to
David
say about
Friesen.
Milt.
Yeah, but I can also put that on the resume. If you play with somebody once, I say to him. I mean, one time I sat in with Elvin Jones for 3 tunes at a festival. 3 tunes doesn't really
Wow.
count. So I haven't put Elvin on my resume for that reason. But the one gig with Art Farmer, it was a gig, so I put him on the resume. So same situation. He came in as a single, and this was early 80s. And he said, the last time I was in Portland, Oregon was 1953. So he hadn't been in Portland in about 30 years. So same thing. He came in. He actually had a book of tunes, but all the charts were very well prepared, easy to play. I think I sort of surprised him initially because he just didn't know what I sounded like or who I was, and kind of took him aback a little. But then he sort of relaxed. He said, "At first, I was kind of in shock. I mean, he just hadn't heard me before and didn't know what I sounded like." But then he kind of relaxed and he played beautifully. And, I had done my homework, obviously, and told him I really enjoyed the records he'd done with Jim Hall. They had a working group in the 60s.
Oh yeah.
So even though I was still relatively young at that point, I was maybe your age or a bit younger. Um, he could tell that I had done my homework and I was trying to do a decent job. So same bassist, David Friesen. I think the same drummer, Mel Brown, but we added piano for that particular gig, a man named Eddie Weed, who was a very seasoned player and a nice man. And same thing, Art was relaxed, friendly, comfortable, not overbearing at all, very accommodating. So very much like Milt. I mean, they're from the same generation. And I think, the lessons that you learned coming up in terms of how you want to kind of comport yourself as a leader on the stand and how you want people to feel. And they both probably had, I would imagine, dozens of years playing as a single in addition to leading their own bands. So you develop a strategy to immediately go in with a group that you never played with before and find the tunes that are realistic for everyone to play comfortably and just try to make the very best evening of it. And Art was exactly the same way.
Nice. That's awesome. So the next person I want to ask you about, I particularly appreciate as a big fan of Ed Bickert. So you've played with Don Thompson?
I have. And Ed, I met a few times, but I never had the pleasure of playing with Ed. He just left us in his late 80s, unfortunately.
Yeah,
One of
unfortunately.
my very favorite guitar players. And Don, I met, I think I initially met Don. This is a funny story, actually. I wasn't on this gig. But Don and Terry Clark, Don just had his 80th birthday. I haven't talked to him in a while. I'd love to talk to him. We've done a few gigs that I'll tell you about. But one of the first times I met Don, he had come to Portland. This is also early 80s, in the trio with Jim Hall's trio with Terry Clark and Don. They played beautifully. But sometime earlier in that tour, Terry had slipped and fallen on some ice in the Midwest, and his left arm was in a sling. He set up the full drum set and played the whole gig with both feet and his right hand only. And honestly, after the first tune, I didn't really notice. And they were giving him solos and fours and eights and everything else. Terry's an incredible drummer. I had a chance to do one gig actually with Don and Terry both. I was pleased that I got a chance to play with that stellar rhythm section of Jim's. So I think the first time I actually played with Don, we were both teaching up in Banff, which is a learning center in Western Canada that has done a jazz workshop for about 30 years. And one year I was there for about 10 days filling in for Mike Stern, who couldn't make it on short notice. And the faculty that year was Don, Dave Liebman, Kenny Werner, he was the director that year, Keith Copeland, who else? Some other folks, but a great faculty. So Don and I were just hanging out one of the evenings before we started teaching, and he said, "Oh, we can record here." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, there's a studio here that they use to train engineers, and if you're either faculty or student in the jazz workshop, you just sign up with one of the student engineers in training, and they're very capable. I've been there before. This is Don talking, and we'd have a good time." And Dave Liebman is standing nearby. And I had known Dave at that point for more than 20 years because he used to play with Link Chamberlain. That's how I met Dave. And Dave said, "Oh, I'll show up too." So no time to rehearse. We were busy teaching all week. And so we showed up at the appointed time for the recording. The engineer was very nice. He was capable. And no Dave. So I just figured he got busy. So Don and I started playing. And then Dave showed up in the middle. So that eventually became a record for my friend on the origin label called the BAM Sessions. Dave found the 3 tunes that he had time to show up for. And then Don and I played the rest. And then Don and I have done probably another maybe 3 or 4 gigs in Toronto. He and Terry Clark are both from Vancouver, BC, west coast of Canada, but they've both been in Toronto for many years. And so Don booked, when I was nearby, Don booked a few gigs for us at some little clubs in Toronto, and they were an absolute pleasure. And Don is, by the way, first call on upright bass, piano, and vibes. And I think he plays some other instruments as well. And he's just equally good on all 3. And a stellar musician. I think he's still active. And I owe him a phone call. I haven't spoken to him in quite a while, but a stellar musician. And he used to play with George Shearing as well, where they do bass and piano duos, and then they do 2 pianos. So Don can really hold his own with George Shearing on the piano. He's a stellar musician. And he's also quite a good arranger.
I remember the first time I heard him play piano was on that Jim Hall album, Circles, I believe it's called.
Yep.
And it has that
Yep.
opening track, and there's this crazy piano. So I was like, who's this piano player? And I look at the, the liner notes, and it says Don Thompson, bass and piano. I had no idea. But yeah, he is an incredible musician.
And he's just as good on vibes.
Wow.
Yeah, he's a stellar musician. I mean, there's some excellent Canadian musicians. I've done some of the festivals in probably, I don't know, maybe 6 of the Canadian cities. And I've played in some other cities. So I know many Canadian musicians. There are some stellar world-class Canadian jazz musicians. And a really nice festival circuit in the summer too. They're always fun. I mean, the volunteers who work the festivals are great. They're there because they love the music. So they really treat you well and make sure you get where you're going. And things are well promoted and generally very well run. I'm supposed to maybe try to go back to the one in Edmonton this year, but because of the virus situation, I'm not able to, but I think maybe next year. Last time I played that festival was 10 years ago, but I know the man who books it. Mm-hmm. So I think there's maybe a chance to get back next year, but the festivals are always fun.
What kind of group were you planning on going with this upcoming time?
I generally go to the festivals alone because I don't have the reputation to really bring a group with me, demand that kind of a budget if I'm bringing people with me. But thankfully, I've been traveling long enough that I have good musician friends in all the different places that I can go. So one of the ways I sell myself is as a cheap date. I'm not playing the big main venues. I'm usually playing a club or a smaller venue, which is fine. That's my drawing power. If I can get 50 or 100 people to show up to hear me, I'm thrilled. Very often it's smaller audiences. But I can assemble a good group just about anywhere I'm going, no problem. And I don't have to say to a festival promoter, well, I need $2,000 or $3,000. I can say, what have you got? And we'll try to make it work.
Right. And all that comes back to what you were saying before about building the networks. You've gotten to a point where
Yes,
you have those networks scattered throughout the United States and Canada, and I'm sure in Europe as well. So if you go there, you have that
yes.
ability to just, have musicians that you know of in the areas that you can call to play with. I have two other people I wanted to ask you about that you've played with. So we'll
Okay,
stick to the guitarists for now. So you've played with Herb Ellis.
I did. He was a funny man. I do have a couple of stories about Herb. We may have only done one gig, and then we did a few workshops together. He was a very nice man, very unassuming, and we were really different players. But I think he was open-minded and open to playing with it. He played with lots of different guitar players and the great guitars, and probably lots of other settings too. So he was open to playing with other guitar players, and even though he had a very particular style, which I liked a lot, he was open to playing with other folks. I think he found some of my chord voicings interesting, and he could see I was trying to do something different. So the one actual gig we did was in Portland. He also came through as a single, and it was the same club that I had played with Art Farmer. Actually, it was a fairly well-known club in Portland that was beginning to bring some national acts in. So I was going to pick him up in the hotel lobby in downtown Portland, bring him over to the club. So he comes down into the lobby, and he's got his 175. This is before Gibson made the 165 model for him, which kind of looks like a 175. And he had his guitar in a green garbage bag with the neck sticking out. This is February in Portland, and it's not as cold as Connecticut, but it can be kind of cold and rainy. So I said, Herb, where's your case? And he said, no, I don't need the case for the gig. I'll just wipe this off when I get to the club. This is lighter. So he just threw the guitar in the back seat in the garbage bag, and we get to the gig, takes the towel, wipes it down. Sure enough, he's ready to go. Pretty funny. But, he was a generous guy. He was very happy to, a little like Art and Milt in the sense that he just wanted to play some tunes and have fun. He did have a book, but there were tunes that were just standards. They were not difficult to play. They were all fun. I mean, certainly he was in groups that had arrangements like the Oscar Peterson Trio and the great guitars. Those were more arranged formats, but he was also perfectly happy just to go out as a single and play tunes with you. And he was the same thing. He was generous. He was relaxed. He gave everybody plenty of solo space. He was made sure that everyone was introduced properly. And I thought he was a generous man. I liked him.
That's great. It's always nice hearing this about guys because I think a lot of guys, you really admire their playing, but then you never really know what they're like as a person. So finding out stuff like that is always for me, it's just really nice to hear that about people that I admire.
Mm-hmm. I would say in general, most of the jazz musicians I've met are down to earth, supportive, friendly, because they know it's hard to try to make a living playing this music, and we all do it because we love it. And they understand this. Some of the really famous folks have bigger egos, some. But I'd say in general, most jazz musicians are approachable, very nice, supportive, happy to try to help.
Yeah, that's great. And then the last person that I wanted to ask you about was Tom Harrell.
Okay, I have a few stories about Tom. I haven't seen him in many years. The last time I played with him actually was 93. But I did a few gigs with him in the early 70s before I came out to Portland. He was playing already well then. I think at that point he'd already played with Horace Silver and come up with a bunch of bands. Very distinctive style. And my friend David Friesen, on maybe the last record I did with David, used Tom. We did do any gigs with David and Tom, but Tom played beautifully on that record. And David's music was a bit challenging in the sense that it's not typical diatonic harmony, but Tom was more than up to the task. He did beautifully. So I hadn't seen him probably since then, since 83. And then in 93, yes, in the summer of 93, I had a little tour in Europe, which turned out actually to be about 6 weeks. I was able to put three things together. And I had a friend who was booking a small club in the basement of a hotel in Paris. And I hadn't actually worked for him, but he and I had been in touch. And he said, oh, Tom Harrell is coming as a single. Would you like to play with him? And I said, of course, if Tom would be consider doing it, I'd be happy to. So Tom remembered me, but we hadn't done any gigs together. We'd just done that one recording. And then that's not quite true. We'd done a few gigs in the early 70s, but I hadn't played with him in 20 years. And we'd done the one recording in 83. So it was a very good French bassist, me and Tom, so kind of a little chamber group, just the three of us in this small basement club, packed every night. And one night, Lester Bowie came in from Chicago Art Ensemble, sat right at the front table. And I thought, boy, he sounds so different from Tom. And he loved the music and super friendly, kind to Tom, very supportive. And so we did a week. And Tom couldn't have been nicer. And we played some of his tunes, some of which I still have the charts for. He's quite a good composer. So over the years, I've played Scene is a really pretty waltz of his. And also, what's the other? There's a long form bossa nova. I'll think of it in a minute. Quite nice. But he's a very good composer. And I think he's still quite active. And he thankfully has a really supportive wife because he's dealt with some physical issues over the years that have made it challenging for him to tour. But I think, music has really helped him to maintain his equilibrium. And his wife, I think, has been super supportive and helpful. She's a documentary filmmaker. I met her that one time we were in Paris 25 years ago. More than that now. It was 93. But that gig was fun. And he was, I think he also, having played with Jim Hall, he liked sort of the dialogue, especially in the chamber group without drums, just with the three of us for that week together. It really was fun.